Maggie wasn't looking for love. After her last relationship ended in heartbreak, she had sworn off dating for a while. But when her best friend dared her to try an app just for fun, she reluctantly agreed. Scrolling through profiles was a mix of entertainment and frustration until she came across Jason's. His bio was simple: adventurer, dog lover, and food enthusiast. His photos showed him hiking, laughing at the beach, and holding an enormous German Shepherd with a goofy grin. He seemed normal, refreshingly normal. They matched, and their conversations were surprisingly easy. Jason was charming, funny, and thoughtful. He even suggested they skip the typical coffee shop meetup for something more unique, a surprise first date. "I promise it'll be worth it," he texted with a winking emoji. Maggie hesitated. Blind trust wasn't her strong suit, but she decided to go for it. Life's too short to play it safe, she told herself as she picked out a casual outfit that night. Jason was punctual, pulling up in an older but well-kept truck outside her apartment. He stepped out, wearing jeans, a leather jacket, and a warm smile. Maggie noticed immediately how much more handsome he looked in person. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked, opening the passenger door for her. Curiosity outweighed caution. "Lead the way," she replied, climbing in. The first stretch of the drive was wonderful. They chatted about everything from their favorite movies to their most embarrassing childhood moments. Jason kept the conversation light and sprinkled in jokes that made her laugh out loud. But as the city lights faded behind them, Maggie began to notice how remote their route had become. The highway turned into a winding road lined with dense trees, the only light coming from Jason's headlights cutting through the darkness. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. "You'll see," he replied, his tone teasing. "It's a spot I found a while back. Perfect for stargazing. I thought it'd be a nice change from the usual first date." His answer was sweet, even thoughtful, but Maggie couldn't shake the unease building in her chest. She hadn't told anyone exactly where she was going tonight, and now they seemed to be miles from the nearest sign of civilization. "You do this often?" "Take girls to the middle of nowhere," she joked, trying to lighten the mood. Jason glanced at her, his smile faltering for just a second before returning. "Not often. Only when I'm sure they'll appreciate it." Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with her. She turned to look out the window, the trees flashing by like a never-ending wall. Finally, Jason slowed the truck and pulled onto a dirt road. They drove a short distance before stopping in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. He turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. "Here we are," he said, gesturing toward the sky. Maggie stepped out hesitantly. She looked up and saw the stars, brighter and more vivid than she'd ever seen them. For a moment, the unease in her stomach eased. Maybe she was overthinking things. Jason pulled out a blanket from the truck bed and spread it on the ground. "Come on, sit," he invited, patting the spot beside him. She joined him, but her sense of vulnerability grew. The night was too quiet, the forest too still. "I'm going to grab us some snacks," Jason said suddenly, standing up. "Stay here. I'll be right back." "Wait, where are you going?" she asked, alarmed. "There's a cooler in the back," he replied with a reassuring smile. "Relax. I won't be long." He disappeared into the shadows, leaving Maggie alone. The clearing seemed to grow darker in his absence. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, the chill in the air biting at her skin. Minutes ticked by, and Jason didn't return. Maggie stood up, her eyes darting toward the truck. She debated calling out to him but stopped herself. Something about the silence felt oppressive, as if even her voice would be swallowed by the night. Then she heard it, a faint rustling coming from the trees. "Jason?" she called softly. No answer. The rustling grew louder, closer. Maggie's heart raced as she backed toward the truck, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. But it wasn't Jason. It was a man, tall, gaunt, and wearing a tattered hoodie that hung off his frame. His eyes gleamed unnaturally in the moonlight, and his lips twisted into a grin that made Maggie's blood run cold. "Didn't expect company tonight," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Maggie stumbled backward, hitting the side of the truck. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The man took a step closer, and Maggie's hand darted to the truck door. She fumbled for the handle, but before she could open it, Jason's voice rang out behind her. "Leave her alone." Jason emerged from the shadows, his face set in a grim expression. He was holding something, a tire iron. The man turned to face Jason, his grin widening. "You brought her here, didn't you? How thoughtful." Maggie's stomach dropped. What was he talking about? "Get out of here," Jason said firmly, stepping between Maggie and the stranger. The man chuckled, but after a tense moment, he backed away, disappearing into the trees as suddenly as he'd appeared. Jason turned to Maggie, his face pale. "Get in the truck. Now." Without a word, she obeyed, her hands shaking as she climbed into the passenger seat. Jason threw the tire iron into the back and got in beside her, starting the engine. They drove in silence for a long time, the tension in the air so thick it was suffocating. Finally, Maggie couldn't hold it in anymore. "What the hell just happened?" she demanded. Jason tightened his grip on the wheel. "I didn't think he'd show up. He doesn't usually bother me when I come here." Maggie's jaw dropped. "You knew him?" Jason hesitated. "Not exactly. He's been around before. I didn't think it was a big deal." "A big deal? Are you serious?" He could've. She stopped herself, her voice breaking. Jason glanced at her, his expression full of guilt. "I'm sorry. I thought I could keep you safe." Maggie didn't respond. She stared out the window, the trees blurring together as they sped down the road. By the time Jason dropped her off at her apartment, the charm that had drawn her to him was gone, replaced by a deep sense of mistrust. She never saw Jason again, and she never went on another date with a stranger. Some risks just weren't worth taking. It was a Friday night, and Claire was nervously adjusting her scarf in the cafe's mirror. She wasn't usually the type to meet strangers from dating apps, but Chris had seemed charming. His profile was filled with light-hearted jokes and pictures of hiking trips, and their chats had been easy, fun, and full of laughter. When he suggested dinner at a quaint little restaurant outside of town, she hesitated but eventually agreed. "It'll be an adventure," she told herself. Chris was waiting for her by the curb when she arrived. He was even more handsome in person, with a warm smile that instantly set her at ease. His car, however, was less inviting, a slightly beat-up sedan that looked like it had seen better days. But she brushed off her reservations. "Ready for the best steak of your life?" he asked, opening the car door for her. His enthusiasm was infectious. The drive took longer than she expected, winding further out of the city and into rural roads. The houses grew sparse, and the streetlights disappeared altogether. "Is this place really out here?" she asked, trying to mask her unease. "It's a hidden gem," Chris replied, his eyes focused on the road. Finally, they arrived at an old, dimly lit building with a flickering neon sign that read, "Morton's." The parking lot was nearly empty except for a rusty truck. The restaurant looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, but Chris seemed unfazed as he held the door open for her. Inside, the atmosphere was equally eerie. A few patrons sat hunched over their meals, none of them acknowledging the new arrivals. The air smelled faintly of grease and something metallic. A waitress with tired eyes handed them menus and disappeared without a word. "This place has character," Chris said with a grin. Claire smiled nervously, trying to shake off the growing unease. They ordered steaks, and Chris launched into a story about his latest hiking trip. But as he spoke, Claire couldn't help but notice how the other patrons seemed off. Their movements were sluggish, almost robotic. One man was staring blankly at his plate, his fork suspended midair. "Are you okay?" Chris asked, snapping her back to reality. "Yeah, sorry. Just tired from work," she lied. Their food arrived, and Claire was relieved to have something to focus on. The steak was surprisingly good, and for a moment, she started to relax. But then she noticed the waitress standing in the corner, watching them. No, not watching, staring. "I'll be right back," Claire said, excusing herself to the restroom. The hallway leading to the restrooms was dimly lit and lined with old, peeling wallpaper. As she walked, she thought she heard faint whispers, but when she stopped to listen, there was only silence. The restroom door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and the fluorescent light inside flickered ominously. As she washed her hands, Claire caught movement in the mirror. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. Her heart raced as she hurried back to the table. Chris looked up, concern etched on his face. "You okay?" "Yeah, this place is kinda creepy," she admitted with a nervous laugh. He chuckled. "I guess it is a little. Want to head out after we finish?" She nodded eagerly. As they left the restaurant, the cold night air was a relief. But as they approached Chris's car, Claire froze. There was a figure standing by the passenger door, their face obscured by the shadows. "Hey! Can I help you?" Chris called out. The figure didn't move. "Stay here," he told Claire, his voice firm. She watched as Chris approached the figure, but before he could reach them, the person bolted into the woods. "Probably some drunk looking for trouble," Chris said, trying to sound nonchalant. But Claire could see the tension in his jaw. The drive back was tense. The winding roads seemed darker, the trees pressing in on either side like silent spectators. Claire kept glancing at the side mirrors, half expecting to see someone running alongside the car. "Do you mind if we make a quick stop? I need to grab something from my house," Chris said suddenly. "Your house?" "Yeah, it's just up the road. I promise it'll only take a minute." Claire hesitated but nodded. They pulled into the driveway of a small, isolated cabin. The windows were dark, and the place looked abandoned. Chris got out, motioning for her to stay in the car. She watched as he disappeared inside, the front door creaking shut behind him. Minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. Claire's unease grew with each passing second. Finally, she decided to go check on him. The cabin door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else she couldn't place, something sharp and metallic. "Chris?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She ventured further inside, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The living room was empty, but a door at the back of the house was slightly ajar, revealing a faint light. Pushing the door open, Claire gasped. The room was filled with photos of her. At work, at home, with friends. Some were taken from a distance, others up close. Her heart pounded as she backed away, bumping into a table. "Claire?" She spun around to see Chris standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I can explain," he said, stepping closer. But Claire didn't wait for an explanation. She shoved past him, sprinting out of the house and into the night. Behind her, she could hear his footsteps, his voice calling her name. She ran blindly, the dark woods swallowing her. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop until she saw headlights on the road ahead. She burst out of the trees, waving her arms wildly. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver jumped out, a park ranger. Claire collapsed, sobbing, as she tried to explain what had happened. When they returned to the cabin, it was empty. No Chris. No photos. Just silence. To this day, Claire doesn't know who Chris really was or what he had planned. But she's never used a dating app again. Megan wasn't sure why she said yes. Maybe it was the way Liam had made her laugh in their chats, or the fact that her best friend had been pushing her to get out more. Either way, here she was, standing outside a trendy new wine bar downtown, clutching her phone nervously. "On my way," Liam had texted 10 minutes ago. A few minutes later, a sleek car pulled up, and Liam stepped out, flashing her a smile that could melt glaciers. "Sorry to keep you waiting." "Traffic was crazy," he said, holding the door open for her. Megan appreciated his charm and easy demeanor as they drove to the restaurant he'd chosen, a cozy Italian spot on the outskirts of town. The conversation flowed effortlessly. He was funny, attentive, and everything his profile suggested he'd be. "I hope you're hungry," Liam said as they pulled into the parking lot of the restaurant, a small building draped in ivy. The atmosphere inside was intimate, with dim lighting and the aroma of garlic and freshly baked bread. The hostess greeted Liam by name, and Megan raised an eyebrow. "Do you come here often?" she teased. "They've got the best lasagna in town," he replied with a grin, guiding her to a table near the window. The dinner was perfect. They laughed, shared stories, and even split a bottle of wine. Megan felt herself relaxing, the initial jitters melting away. Liam was easy to talk to, and the way he looked at her made her feel like the only person in the room. But as they finished their meal, Liam's phone buzzed. He frowned at the screen. "Everything okay?" Megan asked. "Yeah, it's just my buddy. He's having some car trouble nearby. Mind if we swing by and check on him? I promise it won't take long." Megan hesitated but nodded. It seemed harmless enough. The drive wasn't far, but it led them out of the well-lit main streets and into a quieter, more secluded area. They pulled up to an old, abandoned-looking warehouse. Liam parked and stepped out, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Stay here. I'll just be a minute," he said. Megan watched him walk toward the building, disappearing into the shadows. The uneasy feeling that had been creeping up on her since they left the restaurant settled in her chest like a stone. Minutes passed, and Liam didn't return. She glanced at her phone, considering calling him, when something moved in the rearview mirror. A shadow. Her breath hitched as she turned to look, but there was nothing there. The parking lot was empty, save for Liam's car. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it as her imagination, but the unease lingered. She decided to get out of the car. The warehouse loomed in front of her, its broken windows like jagged teeth. "Liam," she called, her voice echoing. No answer. She stepped inside cautiously, the musty smell of damp wood and rust filling her nose. The interior was dark, save for the faint glow of a single overhead light in the distance. As she walked, her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the concrete floor. Then she heard it, a faint whisper. "Help me." Megan froze. The voice was coming from deeper inside. "Liam," she called again, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound. It led her to a small room in the corner of the warehouse. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see the glow of a phone screen inside. She pushed the door open slowly, revealing a chair in the center of the room. On it sat a phone, Liam's phone, its screen lit up with a text message. "Run." Her heart thundered in her chest as she spun around, only to see Liam standing in the doorway. But something was wrong. His warm smile was gone, replaced by an expression she couldn't quite place, cold, detached, calculating. "You shouldn't have come in here," he said quietly. "Liam, what's going on?" she stammered, backing away. He stepped forward, blocking the exit. "You weren't supposed to see this." Megan's mind raced. "See what?" "I don't understand." Before she could finish, a sharp noise from outside the room interrupted them. Liam's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping out and closing the door behind him. Megan didn't wait to see what would happen next. She darted toward the phone on the chair, grabbing it and frantically scrolling through his messages. Her stomach churned as she read the texts. "She's perfect. Tonight's the night. Make sure everything's ready at the warehouse. No mistakes this time." Her blood ran cold. She had to get out of there. She pushed the door open just enough to peek out. The warehouse was silent, the shadows shifting unnaturally in the dim light. She moved quickly but quietly, retracing her steps toward the entrance. Just as she reached the main door, she heard Liam's voice behind her. "Megan." She didn't turn around. Instead, she bolted, her shoes pounding against the floor. She burst out into the parking lot and sprinted toward the road, not daring to look back. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, growing louder. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her heart pounding. In the distance, headlights appeared, a car approaching. She stumbled onto the road, waving her arms desperately. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver jumped out, a woman in her late 30s. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice filled with concern. "Please, help me," Megan cried, glancing back to see Liam standing at the edge of the road, his face obscured by the shadows. Without another word, the woman ushered Megan into her car and sped off. Megan didn't look back again. She didn't want to see if Liam was still standing there or if he'd followed. To this day, she can't explain what Liam's true intentions were that night or what he had planned in that warehouse. But she knows one thing for sure: she'll never trust a charming smile again.